Communist China under Mao Zedong, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. Throughout history, authoritarian regimes have inflicted oppression, extortion, enslavement, terrorism, torture, and murder upon innocent people. Many Americans firmly believe and confidently proclaim that such a thing could never happen in the United States. But is this just wishful thinking? Or is there something fundamentally different about the United States that renders it immune to the tyrannical oppression that has plagued every other major empire in history? The first step in analyzing the claim that it can't happen here is to identify and define what it is. Many people have an oversimplified, almost comic book type view of tyranny, an image of the obviously malicious dictator wringing his hands while cackling maniacally about ruling the world. In the real world, tyranny has always come about under the guise of defending the nation, protecting the people, and creating law and order. To gain power, a tyrant, at least to begin with, needs the support of the people. A successful tyrant cannot openly exhibit malice and lust for power, but must craft his message so as to convince the people that his intentions are noble, that he wants truth and justice to prevail, and that the way to make that happen is to give him power and control. Authoritarian regimes grow by exploiting people's fears, worries about economic troubles, crime, foreign invaders, and so on, and convincing the people that the solution is for a political leader to be given total control so he can protect the people from the evils of the world. This is always the template out of which tyranny grows. No matter how repressive or brutal a regime becomes, those in power will continue to claim good intentions, and will insist that extraordinary government powers are necessary to protect the people and to create justice and order. Throughout history, every time humanity has taken a step away from freedom and towards tyranny, it was done in the name of serving and protecting the nation and the people. But because every candidate, every political party, every regime claims to be for peace and freedom, for truth and justice, for protecting the innocent and defeating the wicked, how can the potential tyrants be recognized and kept out of power? Every tyrant claims to have noble motives, insists that the people should trust him, and promises to use his power for good. Finding the truth, therefore, requires one to look past a politician's words and to focus instead on his actions. There are several basic philosophical principles which tyrants always seek to undermine and destroy. In any country, determining whether these principles are being respected or violated indicates whether that country is headed towards tyranny, or is already there. Historically speaking, it is a relatively new concept to suggest that there are limits to what rulers may do to their people. The Magna Carta 800 years ago expressed the radical idea that even the king should be subject to certain restrictions. Subsequent English law and later the U.S. Constitution specifically described certain things that those in power can never have the right to do. Several examples of this are found in the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, collectively known as the Bill of Rights. This would include freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, freedom from being forced to testify against oneself, the right to be armed, the right of an accused to a trial by a jury of his peers, and so on. The Bill of Rights did not claim to create any of these rights, but instead identified such rights as inherent to humanity, pre-existing and outranking all man-made authority of any kind. Rights that should never be violated, even if the majority supports such violations, and even if those in power claim that such violations are urgently necessary and are being done with the best of intentions. The authors of the Bill of Rights were well aware that once these principles are abandoned, the end result will always be unbridled tyranny. The U.S. Constitution describes a very restricted, limited role for the federal government to play. The 9th and 10th Amendments, the last two in the Bill of Rights, declare not just that there are some things the federal government may not do, but that it may not do anything except for what is clearly and specifically authorized by the Constitution. Congress was not intended to have the power to control, regulate, or prohibit whatever it wished, but to have power only over certain specific matters. Such a concept cannot be found in the founding documents of the notorious tyrannies in history. On paper, this would seem to be a fundamental difference between the United States and many other regimes. But has that difference translated into reality? The federal law books today are full of thousands of pages of laws imposing taxation, regulation, and sometimes criminalization of matters which the Constitution never put under federal jurisdiction, including education, healthcare, food, retirement plans, caring for the poor, air travel, trains, cars, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, firearms, explosives, gambling, communications, employment practices, farming, wildlife, and all manner of production and manufacturing. In order to acquire and maintain power over such matters, politicians appointed judges to manufacture legal excuses for ignoring the constitutional limits on federal power. Of note, the Constitution itself does not say that the courts are the ultimate deciders of what is or is not constitutional. Nonetheless, shortly after the Constitution was written, the U.S. Supreme Court simply declared itself to be the ultimate judge of constitutionality. Since then, the federal courts have gradually whittled away at the concept of limited powers, fabricating justifications and rationalizations for violating the principle. One significant example occurred in 1942, when the Supreme Court ruled that Congress could regulate and control a farmer growing and consuming his own wheat on his own property under the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The outrageous rationale was that the farmer growing and consuming his own wheat, though such activity is neither interstate nor is it commerce, might have an indirect impact on interstate commerce, because if the farmer had not grown his own wheat, he might have purchased wheat elsewhere, which might have traveled through interstate commerce if he had. And so, with the obvious premeditated intention of drastically expanding federal power, the court simply manufactured a new legal excuse for putting nearly everyone and everything under federal control. Both major political parties have enacted legislation far beyond anything the Constitution ever authorized, while continuing to appoint judges who will give their blessing to such actions. And this has often occurred with public approval, by people more interested in the promise of being protected and taken care of than they are in the fundamental principles of freedom. Ultimately, the American politician and the American voter have cooperated to completely destroy one of the primary checks against tyranny. The concept of due process dictates that when the state intends to take someone's property or freedom, it may not do so arbitrarily, but may do so only by way of the legislative process, providing individuals with an opportunity to challenge the claims and actions of the government at an open and fair hearing before a neutral judge. And in criminal cases, the government may not punish people based on mere accusations or suspicions, but must provide evidence sufficient to convince a jury of his peers beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused has violated the law. While the Fifth Amendment mentions the right to due process, merely having such words on paper does not necessarily mean the principle will be adhered to in the real world. Unalienable rights. And though the U.S. Constitution does not authorize anyone to suspend the principle of due process, the U.S. government has spent decades fabricating excuses for circumventing and undermining the principle. One of the most widespread violations of due process can be seen in the U.S. criminal justice system. In the vast majority of cases where an individual is accused of a crime in the United States, there is no trial, no jury, no public hearing, no proof of guilt, no evidence presented, and therefore no opportunity to challenge or rebut the evidence. This complete denial of the right to a fair public trial by a jury of one's peers is done via a procedure known as plea bargaining. In short, the accused is told that if he confesses, his punishment will be less harsh than if he demands a trial. When faced with the potential expense, embarrassment, fear, stress, and pain involved with being prosecuted by a government with virtually unlimited resources, even many innocent defendants confess, relieving those in power of having to prove guilt. Concepts such as innocent until proven guilty, having one's day in court, the state having the burden of proof, the proof needing to be beyond a reasonable doubt, and the right of the accused to not testify against himself are all destroyed by threatening and intimidating a defendant into accepting a relatively lenient punishment for a crime which may never have happened. The underlying message is a very old one. Confess, whether falsely or truthfully, and your suffering shall be reduced. To make matters worse, all defendants who submit to such threats are also required to sign a statement saying that they weren't coerced into confessing. Many countries, recognizing that plea bargains amount to forced confessions, prohibit the practice. But in the United States, it is how the vast majority of criminal accusations are settled, without evidence, without a trial, without the government ever proving anything. But the ultimate contempt for due process evolved relatively recently in the U.S., with the Bush and Obama administrations claiming the right to indefinitely detain individuals without trial or charges, meaning someone could be imprisoned for life without ever being formally accused of any wrongdoing, or even if he was charged, put on trial and found not guilty. Even more drastic than that is the policy, again condoned by the Bush and Obama administrations, saying that the president has the power to issue orders to kill individuals outright, foreigners and U.S. citizens, without warrant, trial, or charges. The result of all these policies is that, notwithstanding what the Fifth Amendment says about due process, the federal government can take the property, freedom, and life of any individual it chooses without any due process at all. The only thing that has ever prevented tyranny, or even slowed it down significantly, is a people willing to disobey those who wear the label of authority. The sentiment expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that when any government becomes a violator rather than a protector of individual liberty, the people have the right and the duty to alter or abolish that government. And only those willing to directly combat injustices done in the name of authority and law have ever been an impediment to the would-be tyrants of the world. Some hope for liberty and some spirit of resistance is now coming from a seemingly unlikely source: government enforcers. A number of U.S. soldiers and law enforcers have pledged not to participate in disarming the American people, in detaining people without charges, or in other violations of individual rights. Members of the U.S. military all pledge an oath not to serve the politicians, but to protect and defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Recently, more and more men and women in uniform have been taking that oath seriously. The quickest and least destructive way for a tyrannical agenda to be ended is for the government's own enforcers to refuse to inflict injustice upon the people. Freedom will only survive if the people have not only the will to disobey, but the means to forcibly resist state aggression. Because every government uses force against the disobedient, that leaves the people with only four choices: submit and obey, be caged or killed, run and hide, or forcibly resist. The last of which can be done successfully only if the people possess the weaponry needed to combat the violence of the state. It was with that in mind that the Second Amendment was penned. The only people who have ever defeated tyrants are those who were able and willing to disobey the masters. History makes it perfectly clear that there is no document, no system, no election, no political procedure that can prevent tyranny. In the end, the path society will take is determined solely by what resides in the hearts and minds of the people. A population content to perpetually bicker over authoritarian control, each seeking to use government to control and extort his neighbors, to force his values and preferences onto others, will, sooner or later, descend into tyranny. Only a population which understands and loves the concepts of self-ownership and self-determination, only a population that yearns for a world of equals, interacting voluntarily with no masters and no slaves, with an unflinching and uncompromising loyalty to the principle of individual liberty, can ever know true peace, justice, and freedom.